categories of kin we do not marry. We do not marry our mothers, we do not marry our fathers, our brothers, and our sisters. That's the only thing that's universal. No culture on the planet marries any in those. But, as we've already figured out, that sometimes who is our kin is a little more flexible than we thought. So we may see people we would consider close kin not considered close kin by other groups, and so they don't have the incest taboo, which is basically the taboo against having sex with someone you feel related to. So these are the most universal ones, and while no society today permits intercourse or marriage of these groups, it was certainly practiced in the past. Cleopatra was married to 2 of her brothers. It was serial. One died and then she was married to the next one. And the reason was Cleopatra was required to marry from the family pharaoh, and that meant a very limited choice of husbands, her father or her brothers. So she married one of her brothers and then married another one of her brothers, and it solved the inheritance problem, right? Also, hey, where do you go at Christmas? That's just a joke. Of course, Egyptians didn't practice Christmas. But we don't think she was actually having sex with them. She was famous for the people she did have sex with. Mark Antony, Caesar Augustus. She was quite the attractive woman. And by the way, a couple other cool things about Cleopatra. We always sort of pictured her as looking like Elizabeth Taylor because of our movies, right? She was this stunning, raven-haired, wore the little snake on her head. We always picture her thin. If you translate they actually recorded her weight. And her weight was far from thin. That's one of the reasons she was considered so very attractive. Cleopatra weighed 300 pounds. Yeah, I know, we think hieroglyphs, like little skinny Egyptians. But she was a real skinny Egyptian, not that one. Yeah, and that was one of the reasons she was considered so beautiful. Just keep that in mind when we start talking about that. All right. So, yeah, she, between 30 BC and 224 AD, about 8% of the population of Egypt practiced the same thing, and it's all about inheritance. We think they were marrying them, but the actual intercourse was outside. The father was the brother. But the actual father was someone else. So, of course, for us, we consider relationships between cousins as incest, but you can, in fact, get married. In 19 out of 50 states, you can marry your first cousin. So obviously, we don't all agree about this. Around the world, we find relationships between cross cousins. Remember what a cross cousin was? Your parents were the opposite sex, right? So your dad's sister or your mom's brother's kids are favored. So in some cases, it's going to be parallel cousins, but they'll have rules. It won't be you can marry any cousin. Either the culture will prefer parallel cousins or cross cousins. And usually when it's parallel cousins, it's father's brother. It's almost never mother's sister. It's almost always father's brother. All right. That's what the difference is. There you go. Okay. Now, why do we have this sort of universal taboo against incest? There are 4 ideas here. Each one gets its own slide, so don't freak out. The first one is childhood familiarity. The idea being that if you are raised with someone, you are not attracted to them. That, in fact, the girl next door rarely happens. Because when we know someone as a child, we are much less likely to be sexually interested in. Now, there is some evidence for this and some evidence against this. Evidence for this is that if you look at kibbutzim, which are communal raising of children that's done in Israel, where all the kids are raised together in certain communities, so they're all brought to the crush at the beginning of the day, and they're all raised together. Those kids don't marry within their own kibbutz. And they say, well, it's a book I've already read. They don't mean they've already had sex with that person. They mean they know everything about that person already. They don't want to learn about somebody new. So that's one. And in Taiwan, they practice something called the little bride. And the little bride is basically, when you have a girl, you're raising her for somebody else. She's going to make kids for somebody else's line. She's not going to take care of you when you're old. So raising a girl is of little value. So there are two options. One, strangle the girl before she grows, infanticide, which is another reason we think polyandry occurs more frequently in Sri Lanka, as girls are not as favored. So there's fewer of them. Or the other option is give her to her husband's family to raise from a baby. Like basically, once she's born, fine, you take her. So then they're raised together. They're always told they're husband and wife. They are not raised as brother and sister, but they are raised together. And we find that they have a much higher rate of divorce than we see anywhere across Asia. It's almost 70%. And most of them claim that there is some sort of sexual dysfunction between the two. We have other, individuals who have been raised together as siblings and still find each other attractive. Now, I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to ask you if it's incest. I want you to think about it. My oldest friend in the world, we've been friends since we were 3. Her mom remarried. Her father had died in a tragic kite accident of all the weirdest things. Taken up by a kite and dropped. And he made those rainbow stunt kites, you know, the ones that go in. The inventor of those was at a Guinness World Fair, and they flew the biggest kite and wrapped around his leg. Took him up 100 feet drop. Like, it was horrifying. I'm so glad we didn't go, because, you know, I grew up with him too. He was my best friend's dad. But about 10 years later, Cindy moves away, moves across country, and remarries. And when she remarries a man who has a 16-year-old son. Her daughter is 16. They marry, like, after a month of courtship. I mean, like, it was whirlwind, married. Move the 2 kids in together because now they're brother and sister. And they tell them, now you are brother and sister. And we're shocked as shit when a month later she was pregnant. Right? And it took a month, exactly 1 month, and she was pregnant. When the baby was born, there was a kerfluffle at the hospital because everyone had the same last name. Right. So CPS came because the father of the child was legally her stepbrother. They were brother and sister according to the eyes of the law. And all of us went, ew, you had a kid with your stepbrother? That's disgusting. And by the way, not a kid. They did not leave each other alone in any stretch of the imagination. It was so funny. After the second baby, she was like, maybe I should marry him. I was like, yeah, I think you've made some commitments at this point. I don't think that the marriage is the thing you need to worry about so much anymore. So she married him when she was 18, then had another kid at 21. Oh, and in the meantime, her mom and her stepdad divorced. So then they were no longer siblings. They actually stayed married until they were in their mid-30s. Then they divorced, and then their mom and dad got back together again and married. So I was like, wow, you just can't avoid your ex-husband, can you? I mean, that is the bummer about marrying your stepbrother. Even after you get divorced, Christmas looks the same. And all of my friends were like, ew, she married her stepbrother, that's disgusting, ah! That's incest. Is it incest?
No.
No.
There's no blood or anything between.
There's no blood, right? We're all like, it's social, right? It's social. It's not blood, it's social. It's fit, hip, kid. And yet we reacted all the same way. And I still tease her. I was like, well, I can't help it. You couldn't move outside of Kentucky. I give her shit all the time. Shit, it's hilarious. And sadly, after the divorce, she was shot out of a singlehood cannon. You know, you remember the people who like get divorced in their 30s and suddenly they're like, I missed my 20s, now I'm gonna dress like I'm 19, go to bars, always. She's been doing that now for 10 years, and I'm like, dude. There comes a point when class is a lot more attractive. She's like, I don't know what you're talking about. All right, I'm not doing anything. Okay, so family disruption theory, this idea is that we marry outside of the family because if we didn't, we would not get anything done. We would constantly have rivalry between father and son for the affection of mother and daughter. Everyone would be competing for sexually available family members. And so we must marry outside of the family so as to encourage cooperation between other groups of people. And that's, of course, not the origin of the taboo, and it's a little bit of a strange explanation. So this is sort of a, hey, you know what, taking that, okay, forget the whole, like, everybody wants to have sex with their mother plan. How about instead, if you marry members of other families, then you're going to have cooperation, like when there's big stuff to do, field work and stuff like that, when you have to go out in the field and harvest and all of that. You have multiple families working together because you created these alliances. And actually we've seen in places like the Yana model, the Pierce people, where they do the sister marriage, where in order to get a bride, you have to have a sister that you can exchange for the other guy's sister. We find that it actually keeps violence down between the communities because you're much less likely to go in and raid a village where you could kill your sister. And of course, the oldest reason is, hey, if you have babies together with your siblings, eventually you might have weird-looking kids. And that seems to be, although I will tell you, genetically, the first crossing is not so bad. You cross brother and sister, it's not awesome, but you're probably not going to have a damaged kid, actually. It's after that. Don't cross those kids. Do not cross those kids. There are, of course, potentially damaging things. And of course, you can have inbreeding problems all the way up to, like, second cousins. Where there could be potential. All right, so then we asked the important question, are biology and marriage the only basis for kinship? Is that why we do it? And anthropologists say no. No, we build them outside of direct descendant marriage. You have a person in your family who is actually not biologically or married into you. Spencer has 2 Uncle Craigs. One, my stepbrother, fictive kin, not actually kinship, but that came through marriage, right? So that counts. But we also have one of my dear friends who has been there since Spencer was a zygote. Like he was there before the baby bump ever showed up. And so was around to literally talk to my stomach and be like, be smart, kid. And he did. He would literally start to like, you'll be brilliant, you'll be brilliant, you'll be brilliant. And now he calls him Captain Fuck Up, but whatever. They're at this place in their relationship where they're working out what it means to be men. I'm waiting for the wrestling to occur. But Spencer can rely on him the same way he could an uncle, and possibly more. I mean, my brother's a good brother that way. My stepbrother would do anything for my kid. He actually takes him on camping trips that I won't go on. I appreciate that about my brother. He'll take the kids, he'll grab his sister's kid, my kid, and he'll take them out into the desert and then have them run motorcycles at high-speed things. And I'm like, you do that, because I can't stand and watch, because I'll be like, every time they do something, and also I make bad decisions when given vehicular choices. I crash everything. And I think after I cracked my brother's sand rail, he's never going to let me go again. I had a really good time. I had a lot of fun right before that accident. But my friend Craig, who is Spencer's faux Uncle Craig, has done things like taking care of watching over his school. My brother couldn't handle my son's college education, right? No way. My brother's a nice, big redneck. But Craig, who was also big, by the way, I don't know how both Craig's and his other uncle Craig is 6'7". My brother's 6'6". So he's got these giant Uncle Craigs. But I know that if Spencer were ever in trouble, and I wasn't around, he'd be in a heartbeat. In a second. Not even a question asked. And those are the kinds of relationships. You may have someone you call brother or that you call sister who are actually not your brother or sister at all, but some kid that ended up in your family that you hung out with, right? We all had that friend whose parents were less capable than your parents. Or maybe you were that friend. Right? Maybe you ended up in somebody else's family. I had a whole family of people. I abandoned my family in the middle of high school and just went and lived with another family for a while. It was better that way. And, well, I say I abandoned. They told me I had to leave, so I abandoned them. And I went to live with my best friend in high school, who was a guy, and his sister, and his mom, and his dad. That was a lot of years ago. And I still call them mom, and dad, and my brother and my sister. I still call them that. And as you guys know, I was raised in a communal household. I have a lot of dads and a lot of moms, right? They can't biologically have them all. They are fictive kids. So, yeah. And we often give this as a gift to our friends. You have a child, and you name to that child, you go, this is your auntie so-and-so, even though they're not, of course, related to you at all. But it's a gift. Some of you are those aunties. And we've already had that system in place, culturally, to the system of godparenting. When your child is, after your child is born, you choose someone who will take your place in the event that you die. That's really what godparents are there to do, take your place in the event that you die. When I chose Spencer's godparents, I chose them based on the idea that they were also supposed to provide religious instruction. So I chose an atheist on one side and a fundamentalist Christian on the other. And I was like, you guys do get out. I chose my sister's husband as his godfather and my dear crazy friend as his godmother. And she doesn't do much, actually, now that I think about it. But she's his godmother. He calls her godmother. That's mother's my name. Now, you have this small article in your textbook, the Langakwa of Malaysia. And basically they're looking at they see, this is kind of, they see kinship and relationships as being built by eating, but food that is built at home, because when you produce food, your blood, yourself, all of those things are part of it. And so they felt that all of those body fluids that were important, like your blood, your semen, your breast milk, were all made by home-cooked food. So if you share a home and share food, you're going to have the same blood. Get it? We're all going to have the same blood because the things we eat make our blood. So, and then they're related by blood simply by eating together. So, they're considered brothers and sisters are considered super close relatives when they're young. However, when they move into their own households, they become more distant because they're eating in different parts. So, it's a negotiable thing. So, and of course, they also see their husbands and wives as growing closer together as they live together. I'm particularly fascinated by different types of marriage ceremonies and things that bring people together as kin. The idea of eating, being the thing is not at all uncommon. The Kuoma of New Guinea, the way they marry, the girl comes to the groom's house. The groom's house is really his mom's house because guys all live in one house and wives live in separate houses. And the groom will be at his mom's house when he's unmarried. He'll come to his mom and she'll make his food, and then he goes back and sleeps at the men's house. So the mom picks a bride for him, and then the girl comes to live with the mom, and she only makes her own food, and mom makes the groom's food. Until she decides, okay, they're going to make it, they'll be a good couple, it'll be all right. Then she tells the girl, make his food. And so she'll make his lunch, and he'll come in. He will eat about half of his lunch before his mom says, "Your wife made your lunch today." That's how he knows he's married. Your wife made your lunch today. And then he'll jump up, run outside, and pretend to puke it up. Like, "Oh, this is terrible. This is the worst food ever." It's ceremonial hostility, right? To prove that he and his wife will never be one. But it's done through food. By the way, that's not the most rude marriage ceremony. There's several. There's an Inuit way where a girl will work on her wedding clothes for like 2 years. Her husband does something called bride service, which is he comes to replace her labor. And so he'll work at her parents' house for a little while, and then he'll leave. And she gets all dressed up in her clothes, the ones that she's been making for years. She'll walk to his house. His mom will greet her at the door, take her nice clothes, give her shitty clothes, and that's it. It's over. Wedding done. I know. Hey, girl, like, oh, so much cheaper. Like, you know, the average American wedding is what, like $60,000? I went to a very nice wedding this weekend. I went to a Persian Argentinian wedding this weekend. I'm still full. I ate so much food. Yeah, and that was, like, of course, a big thing. We consider it like there must be an event, right? Magic words must be said, and they must be said by someone who has the right to say the magic words. You can get the right by going to Universal Life Church online, but you have to get the right to say those words. And we always have feasting as a major component. So when we see other cultures that don't have the feast, don't have the party, there's no dancing, we're like, what are you people doing? I think it's hilarious. Another one with eating. In the Trobriand Islanders, you guys are reading about the Trobrianders? It's very cool. So they live in little huts like this. Here's the hut. And it's got a floor like this, and the floor is just barely off the ground. It comes up here, and there's a little wall. It's basically to keep like peccary from running in. You don't want any wild pigs just running in your bedroom. So you can literally step over the wall and you step into the house. There's no doors, no windows, there's just a roof to keep the rain off. They live in the tropics. This is a good way. Except for the mosquitoes, it's a good way. So when a boy likes a girl, he'll climb over the little wall, get in bed with her, and they'll start having sex. And she has to giggle. If she's a good girl, she giggles. And then her parents will open one eye and look, because you know where her parents are? Like 3 feet away in another cot. And all her entire family is sleeping in their cots on the floor, and he basically would crawl over other people to get to her. Everybody knew he was there, right? Everybody knows. They all pretend they don't know. And then if the parents would open their eye, and if they like the boy, then they pretend they're sleeping. If they think the boy is shit, then they jump up and chase him out. And the girls are supposed to have sex with lots of boys to decide who they like. When they finally like one, then they go and they eat lunch together in public. She'll bring him food, they'll eat lunch together, and then the rumor will go around that they are married. It's done. Yeah, I know, right? All of us are like, that's so amazing. So many differences. So this idea of food sharing, making the same blood is not at all uncommon or unique to the nightclub. So yeah, so unfortunately with them it extends a little further. Anybody who comes to live with them, an exchange student, an anthropologist, whatever comes in. So that means they can't marry in that household either. This is just a really common idea that we have food sharing becomes, or having long periods of time makes them part of our lives and makes them kin. The Zaman law of Ecuador. These are looking at how, and they are seen as direct kin of the adoptive parents after a while. And this is also not unusual. In Kenya, among the Nandi of Kenya, a woman can become a man and adopt someone else's kids, and then they're hers. I'll explain. So when you marry in Kenya, when you marry in the Maasai, you get a spouse. That spouse is as a female, you come from far away, he paid a bride price for you, he can literally beat the shit out of you, as long as he doesn't kill you. Right? And actually, if he kills you right away, your family's usually obligated to provide a second, a spare. Right? So that's kind of a bummer, a warranty wife, if you will. Or they have to give back all the dowry, all the bride money. They have to give back the bride money. So she has to produce a kid. If she produces a kid, then they don't have to give the money back. So let's say she doesn't produce a kid, and she doesn't produce a kid, and she doesn't produce a kid, and she doesn't produce a kid, or she produces all female children, which is functioning the same thing as not producing any kids. So she produces no kids. She has been getting cattle from him this whole time in trust for her sons, for his sons. The whole time she's been taking care of cattle and getting cattle for him. If she passes out of reproductive ability without having made sons, she can then take on the status of a man. She becomes a man, she has the rights of a man. She never has sex with anyone ever again, that's the rule. Not women, not men. But then she can marry a woman who may have illegitimate kids, like kids she wasn't supposed to have, because when you're a young woman, Maasai warriors are probably your favorite thing, and you just have to be careful not to get pregnant. It's like there's a celebration for you if you make it to your wedding without getting pregnant. You get a party. So, but if they don't, then this woman can marry this other woman, and she becomes a man, and she takes care of this woman's illegitimate kids, adopts them as her own. They are seen by the entire community as biologically hers, even though physiologically impossible. It's biologically hers. They're all biologically hers. So, that is the way they do it in Ecuador. For us, American adoption, even though no matter how tight we see our adopted family, no matter how important our adopted children are, we never see them as crossing the line into being biologically ours. We see biology as immutable. But that is not the same elsewhere. Not at all. All right, here we have cousins by choice. Looking at Asian youth in Southall, England. Southall is one of the stranger places in terms of England. There are actually multiple diverse communities. You would be surprised. I know you tend to think of England as like the land of lily white Brits. It's actually a hugely diverse population. African immigration, Moroccan immigration that's still African but North African, India because of the connection with the colonies, actually a huge population from Hong Kong. There's all of these people. They don't tend to be centered in the center of London because that is crazy expensive, but as soon as you start getting out of the center, as soon as you start getting to Spitalfields or Southall or any places where you pretty much know a football team's name, Arsenal or any of those folks, Manchester U, right? They have immigrant populations, and obviously when you are moving away from your family and your native country, you feel that loss. And what they're doing in Southall is they're creating new kinship ties. So they are expanding who they start calling cousin, so that you could become a cousin. It was like more than friend. More than, if you were a good friend, you became more than a good friend, you became cousin. And they actually treat these individuals, even after they grew, as very strong relationships. Carol Stack looked at the same idea of these kinds of networks in Chicago, Illinois, in lower socioeconomic, primarily black neighborhoods. She saw that it was really a response to economics, that you'd find more people referring to each other as brother. There was some suspicion that it was a linguistic affectation, calling everyone brother or everyone sister. But she discovered in her work in Chicago that actually no, it was acted upon as if everyone was brother and sister, and fostering children was hugely common. So you would, a neighbor may have trouble raising her kids, and you may take in her kids, and they become your kids even though they are still her kids, but they create a kinship relationship. And they saw themselves as becoming related and having these ties of kinship. Some of you are fans of the show Orange is the New Black. And during the second season, there is a point where you can actually see, as an outsider, what this looks like, where without a spoiler, the very dominant, middle-aged black woman who's also the crazy drug dealer has been raising these kids, and they call her mother, and they have been calling her mother for quite some time. And at some point she does something where it makes it very clear that her term as mother is transitory, and it's almost, you almost get disgusted on a visceral level, because even though you know they are not kin, you just go, oh, not okay, not okay. And the reason you have that reaction is because you recognize them as kin the same as they would. They did a really, really brilliant job right now. All right, so if you don't watch that show, by the way, you are missing things. Orange is the New Black is awesome. Not at all safe for work. Nope, not even close. It's a great show. Okay, so we look at kinship tools as creating mutual support, right? That's how we started this conversation. Why do we have kinship? Well, we know who we can rely on. We know what we're doing in that respect. This is the same thing that's going on in Chicago, but on a non-biological level. All right, so kinship and the nation. This is Janet Carson. And basically what she says is that actually kinship is a smaller form of nationalism. And that all of nationalism relies on the idea of kinship, which is why we call ourselves a melting pot, and why we have this idea of we are brothers, we are cousins, we are all Americans, right? We're all born into this giant family under our Uncle Sam. If it's all of our Uncle Sam, then we're all cousins, right? And we say, one of the easiest ways to do that is to marry into the culture. So if you are an immigrant coming in and you marry a member of the culture, it's just like marrying in to a member of the family. And we actually accept that ideologically. We provide citizenship to people, right? You marry into the family. Now you're one of us. Certainly how my cousin made it here. But I'm also a family of immigrants. We're just different, Germany just dumps its immigrants too. And I had a cousin who came here. She's illegal, undocumented. She's not an illegal alien. She's an undocumented alien. And she didn't get caught in anything because blonde and white, but still, she really spoke English. Every time we got pulled over, I was like, oh. And periodically, I'd turn to her and be like, take off! And she was like, I don't understand. Making fun of me, never mind. So she ended up marrying it's almost classic. She married a nice, older gay man whose mom had not yet passed. And his mom did not know he was gay, and had been waiting her whole life for him to find a nice girl and get married. So he found a nice girl, my cousin, married her, which let her stay. She became a citizen because he married her, and he got a beard with his mom, basically. His mom died, went to her grave thinking he was a nice straight man. It all worked out for the best for everyone. Now, of course, just on film said that my cousin entered into an illegal marriage, but I would say, not really, because they did all the same things a married couple would do. They lived together, they shared food together, they shared the same house for 10 years. She did his laundry, he paid her bills, like they were a married couple. Just they didn't do any of the other things a married couple would do, that socially sanctioned sexual part. I thought this was really hard to read. I don't know about you, but she was looking at, Vina Das was looking at the relationship between nationalism, kinship, and religion, where we had the split between India and Pakistan. This may not be very important to you, but for a whole bunch of people in the world, this is extraordinarily important, the split between India and Pakistan. If you are from India, you feel very strongly about it. If you are from Pakistan, you feel very strongly about it. And so when they created these colonial boundaries, they didn't really ask or think about how the people themselves felt about it. And so they drew this line, what we now, but the British drew Pakistan as part of India, which was not part of their identity at all. So after they leave, we have these huge religious tensions because in Pakistan, the majority of the individuals are Muslim of faith, Islamic. And in India, well, Hindu is the dominant religion, but there are many other groups. And so they kept getting angry at each other, and then they split as a nation state. It's still a contentious separation. There's still violence, and of course, women were probably the most vulnerable to the types of violence that were there. And so many women were kidnapped and forced into marriages against their will and across a national border. And even though they were forced, the marriages continued. They didn't just bail on the marriage. Once the marriage had happened, that was it. The girl was married. That was all. And so they started actually forming and creating these new kinship ties. And many women had kids by the guys. So it was an interesting idea because part of the reason that the women stay had to do with the cultural perception of rape, which, as you know, is not universal. Not everybody sees rape as an act of violence by a perpetrator against a victim. Some people see the victim as having a component to it, having a culpability to it. If you have sex outside of the sanctity of marriage, even if it was against your will, you have brought dishonor onto your family, and in many cases, the honorable thing to do is to die for that. So your brother may take it upon himself to murder you for having been raped. So if the women who were kidnapped and raped were to go back, they would be seen as victims of rape, but not victims. The next thing they'd be victim of was murder. So it was in their best interest at that point. Once this had happened, you couldn't close the gate that had already been opened. It was better for them to stay into the marriage they were in. So now, of course, you had national pride as a problem, and there were some campaigns about getting your girls back. And as a national level, they were seen as kidnapped victims. On a local level, if they were returned, they'd bring shame on their families. So it was a really confusing, horrible thing. So at the level of local kinship, their families didn't actually want them back, because to get them back meant that they were then rape victims. So it was, they saw it was more important, the women's purity, the image of their purity, than their kinship ties. That's actually pretty unusual. Well, it's pretty unusual outside of the East, basically, the near and Far East. Outside of there, it's pretty unusual to see it that way. So if they did come back, some of them were quickly married off, like if I would do and marry them really fast. And the kids that came from these marriages were also discriminated against and faced a bunch of shame unless the mother stayed married. Reproductive Jews. Hey, this was also another unusual thing. In Israel, they're of course very, very invested in reproducing the population. You would say there's lots of reasons for that, some of which is they should stop killing each other, but that's my personal opinion. So Jewish religious identity is intertwined with kinship in that you can only be Jewish if you are born to a Jewish woman. So it is very important that Jewish women reproduce. You get it through your maternal descent. So one of the questions they asked was, in surrogacy, if you have a woman who is Jewish, who's a surrogate, who provides the birthing for a woman who's non-Jewish, her egg is also, her egg, is the child Jewish or is the child not Jewish? Right. So, and if they're going to be using eggs, does it matter what the donor is? Rabbis, of course, are debating this with great ferocity. There's all kinds of rules that go along with being Jewish, including, not breaking the Sabbath and all kinds of things. This is sort of the opposite of what we saw in India and Pakistan, in that we see a whole lot of investment in kinship identities. Over, since we only have a few more minutes, but our idea of kinship, you should know, is not something that has been around since time immemorial. Our idea of kinship is actually quite fluid. So after we had this really strong economic boom after World War II, which was actually economically quite good for us. We start ending up with these weird little suburbs, which is something that we didn't really see. And people start seeing cities as a really bad place to raise your kids. So before that, it was much more common for Americans to live in multi-generational homes. Homes where you had multiple, hey, this is on your test, we'll really listen to you. Where you have multiple generations of people who are living under the same roof. These multiple generations of people would include things like your grandmother and possibly your aunt, your uncle. There were all kinds of folks that were there. We don't really prize that type of family anymore because we see it as something that is not modern or not necessarily a sign that you're wealthy in any way. We often see it as a sign of poverty. And that's not necessarily true. It's not really a sign of poverty. It's really about, you have all kinds of goodness about having an extended family. One of which is, what do you have in an extended family that you don't have in a nuclear family? Pardon? Yeah, but there's a function to it that's good. Not working anyway. Guess everyone's here. All right. It's not going. You have things like built-in childcare. All right. You have enculturation happening. I don't have yet. You're still coming. And we have loss of what if you live in a large family like that? Privacy, right? How many of you are living right now with an extended family relative? So this would be anybody besides your parents and your siblings. And if your siblings are grown up and have kids and move back, that's it. Here you are, extended family, right? That's more than half of us. We have this ideal in our head that we're supposed to live mom, dad, kids. But our reality is something that's very different from that. So we end up also with these large sort of stacked up houses and kinship networks include all of our expanded kin. And having our expanded kin living within the same house becomes this sort of concept of family for us. All right, you guys are way too noisy. The rest of it I would suggest you cover most thoroughly on your own since you've already lost focus as you're gone already. I know as soon as I take that thing out, you just tune out. All right, I wish you the best of luck on the exam. Take your kinship diagrams back with Spencer will open the back door. We'll open the door. Diagrams. You may very possibly hate me right now. Yes. I know that. But you may also have been like, that was kind of fun. I kind of liked that. And I'm going to be collecting those from you at the end. In fact, actually what I'm going to ask you guys to do is I'm going to open my office, and as you come in, leave them there. Yeah. That's why this is. But I am focusing more heavily on this. But everything's back. All right. So when we left off, we were talking about nowadays and why this is silly and yet kind of important thing. So now, why would you think that marriage would get stuck at in the back of a section on kinship? Because marriage is one of the ways we add to our kin, right? Marriage is one of the ways we expand our kinship networks. All right. So we talked about on Wednesday some of the unspoken parts. You know, that marriage is really about sort of socially sanctioned sex. Now, what are some motivations altogether for marrying? Kinship may be a massive motivator in marriage. If you're going to marry somebody, you are also marrying their family. And this is maybe one of the reasons arranged marriages are often more preferred. In fact, arranged marriages are the preferred marriage, entering into a marriage agreement around the world. We're weird and you have those companionate marriages where you try to marry for love, but most people recognize that they're entering into someone else's kinship system. So in arranged marriages, what we have are either the parents of the children or someone responsible for the children arrange the marriage between two individuals. Obviously, from a Western point of view, this freaks us out. I had a long time ago, I was teaching at Cerritos College, and I shared an office with a sociologist, a woman who was a feminist sociologist. And one day she is in a complete tizzy because her student is about to enter into an arranged marriage. And she says, "Oh, Alexis, you have to talk her out of this. This is crazy. In the 20th century, imagine such a thing." And yes, this was in the 20th century. And I said, "Well, does she not want to?" She says, "But she wants to, but she's been brainwashed." And I was like, "Oh, Jackie, you don't really understand the benefits of an arranged marriage." And she looks at me and she goes, "How could you? Understanding how women are subjugated across the planet, how could you?" And I was like, "Understanding that love marriages are extraordinarily fragile and arranged marriages have all kinds of support systems, I could. And so she was like, "Well, I'm still going to send her to talk to you." So I talked to the girl for a little while, and she was of East Indian descent, and her parents had chosen a man for her. And I said, "Well, have you ever met him?" And she said, "No, it's not typical. We don't usually meet." I said, "Well, what do you know about him?" She said, "Well, I know he's a doctor, and I'm going to be a doctor, and so a compatible marriage." And I said, "Do you have any misgivings? Do you want a way out?" And she was like, "No, why would I want a way out? My family knows what's best for me. Raised in Huntington Beach, but yet family knows what's best for me." And I said, "You know what? That's awesome. Good luck on your marriage." And I wouldn't even dream of trying to talk her out of it because we look at them as some sort of oppression, and many other people look at it as actually it's quite freeing. And to say that there's no love in an arranged marriage is not true. Many people grow to love the person they were connected to. Your parents aren't just going to randomly pick some dude, right, or some chick for you. They're going to consider your personality. They're going to consider a lot of things because it's in their best interest that you are happy. Because if you are happy, you are making grandbabies. If you are not happy, there will be no babies. So do take care. Now, of course, we were talking about governing the sexual access. All of this you already know. There are some regulations that we regard to sexual access according to gender, to age, things like that. So if you are a young heterosexual and your parents want you to marry, now what happens when you're on the other end of the scale? What happens when you're an older retiree in Florida and you find this nice woman in your shuffleboard tournament, right? And we all go, oh, Grandpa's getting married. We have some issues with Grandpa getting married, right? Because now maybe Grandpa's inheritance may be a question, right? Grandpa's money may be going to this shuffleboard lady, right? But for the most part, we can't stop them from getting married because they are considered of sound mind and they can do what they like. And I think it's kind of interesting. Again, remember we talked about some of the arguments against same-sex marriage, and Doma was that it would be a marriage that would not produce children, and yet in the first time this went before the U.S. Supreme Court, Justice Sotomayor said, well, we allow people who are past reproductive age to marry, right? With no people that, barring some sort of medical miracle, would not have babies, and we don't have a problem with that. And the lawyer for DOMA said, yeah, we would allow that, of course we would. And she said, then where's your argument? And he just sort of stopped. And I was like, I knew I liked that woman. Because I love logic, and that was just, it was a nice logical question. So, who do you marry? Your parents may have very good ideas about who you are and are not supposed to marry. So you may not have an arranged marriage, but your parents may have a very significant opinion about that, right? Maybe your parents expect you to marry within your own ethnicity. Maybe your parents expect you to marry within your own religion. Maybe your parents expect you to marry into your own financial strata or perhaps above, right? Your parents have these expectations. When I married my first husband, my mother wore a black armband to my wedding in protest for who I chose to marry. My stepmom and my dad were delighted. I had chosen a lawyer, right? I had chosen a tall, white lawyer. They were delighted because anything could have happened based on my previous dating history. My parents like to joke that I was more likely to join a biker gang than to get a PhD. And, but my mom was furious, absolutely furious. How dare I marry a white attorney and a Republican to boot? Oh my God, I was denying my hippie heritage to the worst. It was the worst possible person I could have chosen. And she kept saying to me, but I dream of little mixed race babies. I just want you to marry a nice black man and settle down. Right now, we all laugh because that is the opposite of what most parents would do, right? Most parents would be like, marry somebody professional in your race, we'll just do that. Right? And my mom was like, no, this is where all disasters come from. Everyone's too insular, you must marry a black man. And I was like, Mom, you love who you love. You can't help who you love. I love him. I know, it's amazing for me to say that, you guys. I always tease about how horrible it was. But of course, when I married him, I loved him. Of course I did. I did have a moment during the ceremony when I reconsidered. I will admit that. I walked down the aisle, and I always expected that at some point someone was going to say I was too young. Right? Someone was going to say that because age is an issue, right? When you're 19 or 20, your parents would be like, no, don't marry. Well, I was 21. And so I thought for sure someone was going to stop the madness because I was only 21 years old. Nope. As I was walking down the aisle, I start slowing down as I get to the altar. Like, I'm not going with the music anymore. I start just... And I look at my dad and I'm like, Daddy? And he goes right behind me with his hand on my back and keeps pushing me forward. And I was like, Daddy. And he's like, no, second verse, same as the first. It doesn't matter, we can get divorced, just go. And I was like, oh my God, I'm all alone. When they say, who gives this daughter, he really means it. He's, my daddy. Right, like, that was it. I was horrified, and actually, my first husband knew that I might chicken out. He actually said to me, "No matter what, don't you run. If you decide this is a bad idea, right after the ceremony, you sign the paper, and that's what makes it legal. So if you freak out, you just won't sign the paper, won't tell anybody, it'll be fine. Just don't freak out. Don't run." He's like, I know you. You get it in your head to bolt, you'll be gone. And I was like, yes, okay, I promise I won't run. But I have to tell you, my dad hadn't been standing behind me, I would have been like, skirts up, go! Because I realized I was not necessarily making such a good choice for a young person. But that's okay, it worked out fine, I got a kid. I wouldn't do it any other way. Now, no. So, you may have ideas about things like what happens if you fall in love with a first cousin? Well, it turns out it depends on what state you're in. And how old you are, right? In Utah, you can marry your first cousin after you're 65 or 55 or whatever. Past reproductive age, go ahead. And in some cultures, it's you're supposed to marry a cousin. So that would be endogamy, marrying within a group. Or, in most cultures, they favor exogamy, marrying outside the group, your village, your tribe, your clan, whatever. Whichever. So how many do we marry? There's monogamy, polygyny, polyandry, which are actually both under a group we call polygamy. In the United States, actually, we tend to say polygamy when we mean polygyny, frequently. And there was some television show that I saw where this guy was engaging in a relationship with a woman who had multiple partners, and he was like, oh my God, it's reverse polygamy. No, reverse polygamy is monogamy. That's reverse polygamy. What he meant was, it's polyandry. Polyandry is when you have one female, multiple males. And polyandry is not frequently practiced, but is practiced, and actually right now, in the world, the incidences we have of one female, multiple males are only found in one place in India and just outside of Sri Lanka and in Tibet. That's it. That's it. And for them, really, it's an ecological thing, and they all marry brothers. So you'll have a girl who'll marry a brother, but she really marries all the brothers. She usually falls in love with one brother, and then she marries all of the brothers. Even if some of the brothers are young or old or, whatever, she gets the whole package. Now, this does something kind of beneficial in that it slows the reproduction of the population down, because you have one womb. 7, 5, 3 males who might have had each a spouse themselves if they all had a kid every year. Let's say you had 7 brothers, right? 7 brothers with 7 wives at the end of 7 years. We've got 49 kids, right? But you have one bride, 7 brothers at the end of 7 years. You have 7 kids. It keeps people from reproducing exponentially. So, and it also helps with things like inheritance. In areas where land is of great value, you don't want to split your land up with your sons. Because then by the time you have two generations, everybody gets a postage stamp. You get this much space, because we had to keep dividing the land so that everyone, you don't want that. But if everybody's got the same wife, they don't divide the land, and so the family stays richer. Polygyny, though, is far more common. It's actually more common than monogamy. Polygyny is when you have one male, multiple females, and there are 2 versions, sororal and non-sororal. Sororal means he marries all of the sisters. Non-sororal means he doesn't, that the women are unrelated women. And non-sororal is more common. And then there's group marriage. This is an unusual thing that comes and goes. Group marriage is when a group of people will marry another group of people. So there will be multiple males and multiple females, and they will marry each other equally. It's unstable, extraordinarily unstable. But you know the Armana appliance company? They start as a group marriage project. Oneida, the silverware people, they start as a group marriage project. So they move up to wilds as their group marriage, and then what we found was that caring for the children that were the production of this was unequally managed. So, and there were jealousies and all kinds of problems. So group marriage is probably not something you're going to see a whole lot of. All right, so we're going to define monogamy. It's actually the most common form of marriage worldwide in the sense of if you count each couple as one. If you count in populations, actually, now that China's overdone, I guess really you have to say monogamy is more popular than polygamy, but it's close. And of course, in North America and in Europe, it's the only recognized form of marriage. In Africa, monogamy is extraordinarily common. It's much more common to practice polygamy. And actually in Mexico, it's just not recognized quite the same way. It's very, very common for a very successful man to have a family in one city and another family in another city. He's typically married to both, even if he's only got one actual Catholic wedding marriage. I actually got offered to be the lady in the other city. It was very strange. When I was flying to Cancun, this man in the airplane seat next to me was fascinated by me, and I started getting irritated with him. Long flight, and he was like, you know, I have a house in Merida, you know, I have a house in Merida for you. My wife is in Cancun. And I was like, your wife is in Cancun, but you have a house in Merida for me. And he was like, you're beautiful. And I was like, you know what? Thanks, but no thanks. And he was like, you white women, you have no passion. I was like, no, I just have no interest in being number two. That's what it is. If it was like, I'm in love with you and I have no wife and no children, I might have gotten swept away by that. That was some pretty romantic, seriously Latinate stuff. Very heady kind of thing. But when he was all like, yeah, no, you should be my other wife. No. Oh, that's a good idea. But it's still weirdly counted as a monogamous culture. Serial monogamy is pretty much what we all do in Europe and North America. And some of this may provide something surprising to you. Do you think divorce is more frequent or less frequent? The separation of the couple is more frequent or less frequent now than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago? You would say more, right? Actually, no. See, here's the thing. Lifespans were shorter, so it looked a whole lot more like that was going on. But many, many, many people ended unsatisfactory marriages, moved on to other couples, but didn't ever actually divorce or do anything. My father's father, actually, my grandpa. My grandpa, when he got done with his first wife, he just moved away. And then married a different woman and started a family. Another friend of mine, an anthropologist, her dad picked his last name out of a phone book. He already had 3 families elsewhere.
So they never really divorced, they just separated or kind of like left the family?
And just bailed. Yeah, because it turns out divorce was considered shameful. Right? It was actually in some ways almost a kindness to the woman. Because to be a divorcee was a giant horror stamp on your head, even if you did nothing wrong. So you were the divorcee. A king lost his crown over it. Many of you know the story of how Queen Elizabeth II got her throne was because her uncle basically decided that he was in love with this woman who everyone called by her married last name, and because he decided he was going to be with her, he couldn't possibly marry a divorcee. That was impossible. So he gave up the throne because she had the giant stamp of horror on her, even though her husband had actually been a horrible man. So it was sometimes better for them to just pick up and bail. And it still happens all the time. So actually, the number of ended relationships based on A, we live a lot longer, and B, how we handle them is just that we're more, we'll end it now, because divorce is not that hard for us. I'm divorced, I don't have a big stamp of Uhura on my face, maybe for other reasons, but not that. Right? Nobody thought poorly of me when I got divorced, except I was excluded from dating one male. He was Filipino and a staunch Catholic. And we had love, I loved him, he loved me. You know, not love, but, you know, hand-holding. We could date. We did date. And then he was like, I have to break up with you. And I was like, why? It's because you're divorced. I said, so if I were married, that'd be cool? And he was like, no. I said, so you were under an illusion, I mean, my son was already like 6. Like you're under some illusions that I'm a virgin, or what should be? Yes, that's not how that works. And he was like, no, my family will never accept you. You are state. And I was like, well, good thing it's not 1922 anymore. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. So it's very, very, very common in middle-class America to have these serial monogamy families, even what we call blended families, where a couple will marry fairly young, produce a set of children, divorce, each remarry someone else, produce another set of children, divorce, then remarry again, produce another set of children, divorce. It's very common to see these sort of constantly renegotiated families, whereas that was 40 years ago a point of shame. Look at the kids with different last names. That was awful. So, polygamy is the idea of having multiple spouses. Now, it is practiced in a whole bunch of cultures. It's even practiced in the United States. It's just not legal here. Name the state with the highest level of polygynous marriages. That's what you think. Utah. It's not Utah, it's Nevada. Yeah, because as it happens, the Church of Latter-day Saints, the people we refer to as Mormons, they are not pro-polygamy anymore. That was a Joseph Smith thing about celestial marriages, which if you'd ever like to read how that started, there's a really cool book called The Mormon Menace, written at the time by a church member. If you are Mormon, though, don't read it, it's a banned book. If you aren't, however, it's a great book that tells you how they came to the decision to be polygamous. And it's really interesting. And then how they arranged it. It's actually in Nevada because the people who claim to be Mormon, who the Mormon church does not recognize as Mormons, tend to live in closed communities in Nevada. And there's this whole sin about it. A friend of mine was an anthropologist who studied them. She was also Mormon. She found when the Mormon church found out what she had done, they asked him to do with her for studying a group of people who called themselves Mormon and writing about it. So, yeah, that's all right. She's fine. So polygyny is when you have one man with multiple wives. And then polyandry is, again, one female, multiple husbands. The way I remember this, because this is often a test question, knowing the difference between polygyny and polyandry. Let's start with polyandry, it's easier. Poly means multiple, and I look at it as multiple Andrews. You have lots of Andrews, so multiple males. And then polygyny, well, girls go to the gynecologist, right, which is obviously the studier of gynes. So polygynes, he's got a lot of gynes. There you go. Interesting, yeah, here you go. This is actually a fairly typical relationship system, although he's actually kind of young. Typically, the male who has many wives is typically much older. This is polyandry practiced in Sri Lanka, and that's just adorable. Okay, but lots of people are perfectly content to live this way. And by the way, don't make a mistake. There are lots of people in the U.S. who live this way without the official title of marriage. Just so you know, the official title of marriage may go to only one individual in their household, but they may live in a single female, multi-male, or single male, multi-female household, where it's a child-producing household. And while it may be illegal in the U.S. to marry them, you cannot take away a woman's child for being in a polygamous relationship. They tried that, and they failed. So it's not illegal. So yeah, group marriage is just typically fairly unsuccessful. Fictive marriages are, we call them marriage by proxy or ghost marriage by proxy. This happens when you have a woman who's going to marry someone who is maybe dead or could be in prison or possibly has been never there. So the example would be the Noir, where you have a woman who marries a man who's not alive. His brother stands in and stands in, and he marries her, he will even have sexual access to her, but she's not his wife, she's a widow. It actually does good things, because it helps legitimize kids. So they're considered, any kids she has at that point, regardless of who the actual biological father is, are all considered this dead man's child. It's an interesting way of handling illegitimacy. Now, during weddings and how we get married, there is often an exchange, a significant exchange of goods between the bride's family and the groom's family, or the groom's family and the bride's family. Bride wealth is an example where the groom and his relatives make some sort of gift to the bride's family. Basically, it's got to be a lot. It's usually it usually replaces all of the labor that women would have produced for her family. And this is typically in a society where women contribute great deals to subsistence. So they've got to replace all the work that she would have done for them. And of course, they're going to lose their daughter and all the children that she would make. They don't go to her family, they go to his family. So it's a substantial amount. It's usually livestock, money, land. Dowries are when the bride's family basically compensates the groom's family. It's usually seen when women contribute very little to subsistence. But typically, it's actually really truly from the bride's family to the bride. Technically, while her husband may control her dowry, it's ultimately her money. And the family has to be very, very wealthy to give a dowry, because that's money they're never going to see. Dowries are still really common in France, where you have girls get given land by their family. In my family in Germany, you were expected to get a dowry. I got shit, but I was going to be a useful contributing member, so nobody really expected anything. Although my first husband did make a joke about where the heck was his dowry. And in India, there was something horrible going on called bride burning, where you had families who were of high caste but low socioeconomic status being, so a caste system, which we're going to talk about more on Wednesday, but a caste system basically is a rigid, like imagine being middle class, lower class, upper class, and having been born into that and having it stick. It's permanent, it's not mobile. And each of these castes have names, and it's a stamp. That's all. And so just because you're an upper caste doesn't mean that you necessarily are wealthy. It's hard again for Americans to wrap their head around, like they're, like the Brahman, why aren't they all running around with money? They aren't. And by the way, there's a great book about that called Samskara. You should ever have a but they would marry women who were from lower caste but who had high economic standing, marry them, and then the woman would have a terrible cooking accident. It's fairly common for women to cook on the roof, and usually they'll be there with their mother-in-law, and their mother-in-law has pretty much the most control over them. When a woman marries into a family, she's cooking with her mother-in-law. Very important. So the mother-in-law would basically douse the woman in cooking oil and set her on fire, and then bride after bride after bride in some families were being murdered. Like they'd go through 6 or 7 or 8 women, and nobody would say anything. In that case, caste did matter. So people have stopped, we've slowed down the whole dowry thing.